A new dawn. The night of the betrayal lingered like smoke in the air, clinging to the walls of Maya's apartment long after the intruders had been dragged away. For days she carried the memory of it like a scar on her soul, the way the men had burst through her door, the look in Danny's eyes as he realized danger had followed him into the one place he thought safe, the sharp line of fury etched across Vincenzo's face as he promised retribution. But what stayed with her most was her own choice, the way she had stepped forward without hesitation, offering herself in exchange for Danny's safety. It was not bravery she felt, not even defiance. It was love. Not the kind bound by blood or name, but the love of a protector who could not watch innocence be crushed beneath the weight of cruelty. In the days that followed, the Russo estate transformed. Guards doubled, movements tightened, and whispers of betrayal echoed through the halls like distant thunder. Maya saw less of the men in suits, but she did not need explanations. She knew Russo was tearing through his empire, searching for the roots of disloyalty. Yet in the quiet moments when he returned from those long nights, she noticed something different in his eyes. There was still steel, but it was tempered now by something gentler, something she had not seen before. Reflection. Danny, for his part, clung to Maya more than ever. At night, he begged her to read him stories, curling against her side until sleep overtook him. In the mornings, he greeted her with the unshakable certainty of a child who had decided she was his safe place forever. The boy who had once cried out for his father in a supermarket now whispered her name like a shield against nightmares. And though she never said it aloud, Maya realized she needed him too. In protecting Danny, she had rediscovered a part of herself she thought long buried. The part that believed she could make a difference in a world that had too often beaten her down. One evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, painting the horizon in strokes of fire and gold, Vincenzo called Maya to the gardens of his estate. The place was almost surreal, marble statues standing watch among trimmed hedges, fountains whispering their eternal music. He stood there waiting, his silhouette framed by the fading light, his posture straighter than usual, as though the weight he carried had shifted. "Maya," he began, his voice softer than she expected. "Do you know what I have built all these years?" She met his gaze evenly. "Power, influence, a fortress to keep the world at bay." A small, humorless smile touched his lips. "Yes, a fortress of shadows. And I told myself it was all for him, for Danny, that every choice, every sin was worth it if it kept him safe." His eyes darkened, the truth of his words heavy. "But safety built on fear is no safety at all. You showed me that. You, who owe me nothing, risked yourself twice for him. You did what I, with all my resources, failed to do. You protected him with your heart, not with walls or weapons. And it is you who has made me see that my empire is not his inheritance, it is his prison." Maya felt a lump rise in her throat. "Then end it, Vincenzo. End the cycle before it swallows him. He deserves to grow up free, not haunted by the choices of men before him." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the distant rush of the fountain. Finally, Vincenzo exhaled slowly as though releasing years of denial. "I will. It will not be simple, and it will not be without cost. But I will begin to dismantle what I built, not for myself but for him. And perhaps in doing so I will find a measure of redemption." For the first time since she met him, Maya saw him not as a man of power or fear, but as a father, flawed, burdened, yet willing to sacrifice for his son. And in that moment she realized that courage was not only hers to carry. Weeks later, the world outside whispered rumors. Some said the Russo Empire was weakening, that rivals sensed a shift. Others said he was making deals to close businesses that had once been his pride. For Maya, those whispers mattered little. What mattered was the boy who now laughed freely, who no longer startled at every shadow, who ran across gardens chasing butterflies as though the world truly belonged to him. The city, once blind to her existence, now knew her name. Newspapers called her the woman who shielded a Mafia heir. Some painted her as a hero, others as a fool who stepped into fire she did not understand. But Maya paid them no mind. The truth was simpler. She had seen a child in need and she had acted. That was all. On a spring afternoon, Vincenzo hosted a gathering at a community center his family had recently funded. For years, his name had never been associated with public charity, only whispers of shadows. But now he stood before the crowd, his son at his side, and he called Maya forward. "This woman," he declared, his voice carrying through the hall, reminded me what true strength looks like. Not the strength of wealth or fear, but the strength of sacrifice. She stood in front of danger without thought for herself, and in doing so she gave me the clearest lesson I have ever learned. My son is alive because of her. My future is different because of her, and this city will be better because I finally chose to follow the example she set. Maya felt the crowd's gaze on her, the weight of their recognition, but she did not bask in it. She only looked down at Danny, who smiled up at her with the kind of light that could warm even the darkest soul. Later, as the event ended and the night sky stretched above them, Maya walked hand in hand with Danny through the courtyard. The boy swung their joined arms happily, his voice soft as he asked, "Maya, do you think heroes ever get tired?" She looked down at him, her heart swelling. "Maybe. But real heroes don't stop, Danny. They keep going even when they're tired because someone needs them." "And you'll keep going?" he asked earnestly. She smiled, brushing a curl from his forehead. "For you? Always." From a distance, Vincenzo watched them, his expression unreadable but his eyes holding something new. Hope. For the first time in decades, he saw a future for his son not defined by shadows but by light. And he knew that it was because of the woman who had stepped between bullets and fear, the woman who had refused to turn away. That night, as Maya tucked Danny into bed, she whispered a silent promise to herself. She would not abandon him, no matter how tangled the path became. She had shielded him once in a moment of chaos, but now she understood that her shield was not just her body, it was her heart, her love, her courage. And though the world around them was still uncertain, though dangers lurked beyond the gates, one truth was unshakable. A new dawn had begun. Not for her alone, not for Vincenzo, but for the boy who would grow up knowing that real strength was not found in fear, but in compassion. Redemption and sacrifice, the Russo estate, for all its grandeur, was never silent. Beneath the chandeliers and marble floors, beneath the illusion of wealth and order, there was always a hum, a subtle vibration of men moving in shadows, of deals whispered in low voices, of loyalty bought and tested 100 times over. Maya had begun to notice it now, the way the household seemed to breathe differently depending on who entered a room. To Danny, the house was a playground, but to Maya, it was a fortress hiding cracks. And cracks, she knew, always widened before they broke. Weeks after the attack on her, the atmosphere around the Russo family grew heavier. She noticed men whispering near doorways, their eyes sharper, their movements brisker. Vincenzo himself was more guarded. The calm certainty he always carried tempered by a tension he didn't voice aloud. Maya wasn't part of his world. He had told her that more than once, but she wasn't blind. Something was coming. She could feel it in her bones. It happened on an evening that began like any other. Danny had spent the afternoon coloring at the kitchen table, humming to himself while Maya made pasta and her mother rested in the adjoining room. When the knock came at the door, it was not the familiar polite knock of Russo's driver or guards. It was harder, faster, carrying a weight that made Maya's stomach twist. Before she could even open it, the door burst inward. Men rushed in, 3 of them, armed, faces set with grim determination. Maya froze, her heart slamming against her ribs, as Danny dropped his crayon and scrambled to her side. "Stay behind me," she whispered fiercely, pulling him close. The intruders spread quickly, their eyes sweeping the small apartment. One of them sneered. "She's here." Just like they said, the words chilled her. "Who sent you?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The leader smirked. "A friend of Russo's, or maybe not such a friend anymore. Doesn't matter. The point is, he needs to learn what happens when you let outsiders into the family." Betrayal. The word rang in her head like a bell. These men weren't strangers. They were sent by someone inside Russo's circle, someone close enough to know where she lived, someone who wanted to send a message by using her. Her instincts screamed to shield Danny, to curl around him like she had that night in the supermarket. But there was no shelf to hide behind, no police sirens waiting just outside. This time, she was alone. "Take me," she said suddenly, her voice rising with a conviction she didn't even recognize as her own. "If it's a message you want, then here I am. But leave him out of this. He's just a child." Danny gripped her arm tighter, shaking his head furiously. "No, Maya, don't." One of the men laughed. "Look at this. The hero again. You really don't learn, do you?" But before they could act, the sound of heavy footsteps thundered up the stairwell. The doorframe shook, and then the world seemed to explode. Russo's men stormed in, guns drawn, voices sharp with authority. The intruders barely had time to react before they were subdued, dragged to the ground with brutal efficiency. Amid the chaos, Vincenzo himself appeared in the doorway. His suit was immaculate as ever, but his face was carved with rage. He strode into the room, his presence overwhelming, his eyes burning as they locked onto the men who had dared to touch what was his. "You betray me in my own city." His voice was quiet, but it cut like steel. "You think you can touch what I protect?" The men spat curses, but fear flickered in their eyes. They were hauled away, their fate sealed in silence. When the room finally stilled, Maya collapsed into a chair, pulling Danny into her lap, her chest heaving. Vincenzo turned to her then, and for the first time she saw something raw in his expression, something beyond control, beyond power. It was fear, not for himself but for them. "You would have given yourself up," he said, his voice low, almost incredulous. "You were ready to sacrifice for him." Maya looked up, her eyes blazing. "Of course I would. He's a child. He doesn't deserve to live in fear because of the choices adults make. If that means I take the hit instead, then so be it." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick with truths neither had spoken before. Then Vincenzo spoke, his tone stripped of its usual armor. "You shame me, Maya. I have built a life out of power and fear, and yet in all of it I have never seen courage as pure as yours. You risk yourself without thought of gain, without calculation, and it makes me see my world for what it truly is." She swallowed hard, her heart still pounding. "Then change it, for him. For Danny. Because one day all the guards in the world won't be enough, and he'll need something more than walls and guns to keep him safe. He'll need a father who chooses a different path." The words hung in the air, daring him to reject them. Vincenzo stared at her, his face unreadable, but in his eyes something shifted. It was as though her courage had cut through the layers of armor he had worn for years. For the first time he seemed less like the untouchable figure everyone feared, and more like a man faced with the weight of his own legacy. That night, after Danny had finally fallen asleep curled against Maya's side, Vincenzo stood alone in the doorway watching them. His men waited silently in the hall, but he did not speak to them. Instead, he whispered only to himself, his voice so low it barely reached the air. "She's right. The fire I've fed all my life will one day consume my son, and maybe she is the only one strong enough to drag us out of it." In that moment, Vincenzo Russo began to imagine something he had never dared before: redemption. And Maya Williams, the woman who had shielded his son with nothing but her own body, had become the spark that lit it. Trials of loyalty. The first sign that life was changing came quietly, in ways Maya almost missed. At first it was subtle. The unfamiliar car idling across from her apartment late at night, the shadow of a man standing too still in the alley when she came home from work, the feeling of being watched even in crowded streets. She told herself it was paranoia, the residue of the robbery still clinging to her nerves. Yet deep down, she knew better. Danny had become a fixture in her life in the weeks since the supermarket. His laughter filled corners of her home that had long been quiet, his drawings scattered across her kitchen table as though he belonged there. He would sit with her mother, telling her stories with all the imagination of a child, and Maya watched with a strange mixture of joy and worry as her mother's tired eyes softened each time the boy visited. Danny had become more than a boy she had saved. He was now part of her world, and because of that, the shadows that followed him now followed her too. One evening, while walking home from her late shift at the diner, Maya sensed the shift before it happened. The streets were unusually empty, the hum of traffic distant. Her footsteps echoed louder than they should have. Then from the mouth of a side street, figures emerged, 3 of them. Their walk was deliberate, their faces partially hidden beneath caps pulled low. Her heart jolted, every instinct telling her what this was before she could even think. "Evening, sweetheart," one of them drawled, his voice laced with mockery. "You're the brave one from the supermarket, aren't you? The one who thought she could play hero." Maya's pulse thundered. She recognized his stance, the tilt of his head. It was one of the robbers. Her stomach dropped as the pieces fell into place. They hadn't forgotten. And worse, they had found her. Fear clawed at her ribs, but she stood tall, forcing steel into her voice. "Stay away from me." The men laughed, circling closer. "We don't want you," the leader said, his smile chilling. We want a message delivered. You've been keeping close company with a certain man's kid. That makes you part of his world. And when you step into his world, sweetheart, you don't get to walk out clean." Before she could react, one of them lunged. Maya stumbled back, her shoulder slamming into the brick wall behind her. The man's hand reached for her arm, but before he could grip, headlights flared at the end of the street. A sleek black car roared forward, its tires screeching against the pavement. The men cursed, scattering as the car slid to a halt. The back door flew open, and one of Russo's men stepped out, his broad frame filling the night with authority. In a blur, the attackers melted into the shadows, retreating into the alleys they had crawled from. "Maya," the guard barked, striding toward her. "Are you hurt?" Her chest heaved, her back pressed to the wall, but she shook her head. "No, they didn't. They didn't get me." He guided her into the car with no further questions, the urgency in his movements leaving no room for argument. Within minutes, they were pulling through the gates of a mansion she had only glimpsed once before, the Russo estate. Inside, Vincenzo was waiting. He stood in the grand foyer, his expression harder than she had ever seen it. When he saw her, relief flickered briefly, but it was quickly consumed by a storm of fury. "Who touched you?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "No one," she replied quickly, her voice steadier than she felt. "They tried, but your men showed up before it went further." Russo's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening like storm clouds. He turned sharply to his men. "Find them. Tonight. I don't care what it takes." Maya flinched at the venom in his tone. She had no doubt that his words were not empty threats, but what unsettled her more was the heat that followed. His gaze returning to her, his voice softer yet no less intense. "You should not have been alone. From this moment forward, you are under my protection. Do you understand?" Her pride flared. "I never asked for protection. I didn't ask for any of this." "No," Russo admitted, stepping closer, his presence filling the space between them. "But you chose to save my son. That choice bound you to us, whether you wanted it or not, and I will not allow anyone to harm you because of it." Maya opened her mouth to argue, but the words died as Danny appeared at the top of the staircase. He wore his pajamas, his hair sticking up in tufts, his eyes wide with worry. "Maya," he called, his small voice echoing through the cavernous hall. She felt her heart twist. In that moment, every argument, every ounce of resistance melted. She extended her arms, and Danny rushed down the stairs, pressing himself against her as though afraid she might vanish. "I was scared," he whispered against her side. "I thought something happened to you." Maya smoothed his hair, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I'm okay, Danny, I promise. Nothing's going to happen to me." But as she held him, her eyes lifted to meet Russo's, and she saw the unspoken truth in his gaze. Something had shifted tonight. The danger was no longer distant, it was here, clawing at her door, willing to drag her into a war she never chose. And yet, as she looked down at Danny, his small hand gripping hers as though she were the only safe place he knew, she realized that walking away was no longer possible. Her loyalty had been tested, and her choice was clear. She would stay. Not for Russo, not for the protection he offered, but for the boy whose innocence had bound itself to her heart. Whatever shadows came, she would face them. For Danny. Shadows of truth. The days that followed were unlike anything Maya Williams had ever experienced. What began as a single act of instinct inside a Brooklyn supermarket had now reshaped the rhythm of her life. She had expected to return quietly to her old world. The double shifts at the diner, the cracked walls of her apartment, the routine of caring for her aging mother. Instead, she found herself pulled again and again into the orbit of the Russo family. And with each encounter, she felt the weight of something unspoken pressing against her chest, a mixture of gratitude, suspicion, and unease. Danny was the bridge. The boy refused to let her disappear. Almost every day, a black car appeared outside the hospital during her recovery or near her block once she was released. And out would come Danny, bouncing forward with that same unguarded smile, carrying stories he was desperate to share. He would sit beside her, eating cookies she baked, asking questions about her childhood and drawing pictures of her saving him like a comic book superhero. At first, Maya resisted, afraid of the line she was crossing, but the boy's warmth melted her caution. Danny saw her not as a stranger but as family, and in his innocent way he had claimed her as such. Vincenzo Russo, however, was different. Where Danny's affection was pure, his father's presence carried shadows. He visited occasionally, always in silence at first. Standing tall with his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his dark eyes watching Maya as though she were a puzzle he had not yet solved. He never raised his voice, never made threats, yet his aura filled the space like invisible armor. People treated him with a careful respect, nurses lowering their gazes when he passed, police officers stiffening at the mere sound of his name. Maya sensed it too, though she tried not to show it. This was not an ordinary man. This was someone who carried power in the marrow of his bones. One evening, not long after her stitches had been removed, Maya walked Danny to the car, waiting for him outside her building. The boy's small hand was wrapped around hers, swinging back and forth as though the world held no danger. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in a black suit, nodded respectfully as Danny climbed into the back seat. Before the door closed, the boy looked up at her with wide eyes. "You'll come tomorrow, right?" he asked. "Promise you won't forget me." Maya's throat tightened. She smoothed his hair and whispered, "I'll never forget you, Danny. You don't have to worry about that." He beamed, satisfied, and the car pulled away. Maya stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, watching the taillights vanish into the Brooklyn night, her heart torn between warmth and a cold unease she could not shake. Later that week, curiosity pricked at her resolve. She had heard the whispers about the name Russo, about a man who was both feared and respected, about a shadow that stretched over the city like an unseen empire. She had ignored gossip before. It was never her way to meddle in the affairs of powerful men, but now, with Danny sitting at her table drawing pictures of her holding a shield against bad guys, she couldn't ignore the feeling that she needed to understand the truth. At the diner where she worked, whispers often slid across the counter with the coffee cups. Customers spoke in hushed tones about Mr. Russo, about businesses he owned, about debts that vanished or grew depending on his mood. They didn't say the word Mafia outright, but the weight of it lingered in every sentence. Maya listened silently, her stomach twisting. Could it be true? Had she unknowingly tied herself to a man whose life was woven with violence and power? That night, back in her small apartment, she sat at the kitchen table staring at the bills spread before her. The walls hummed faintly with the noise of the city outside. Her mother dozed in the next room, her frail body curled beneath a quilt. Maya rubbed her temples, exhaustion pulling at her bones, and wondered what she had walked into. When her phone buzzed, she jumped. The message was brief. "Dinner tomorrow. My driver will collect you. V. Russo." She stared at it for a long time. Part of her wanted to refuse outright. She had no place at a table with a man like him. Yet another part whispered that she couldn't keep hiding from the truth. If she was to protect Danny, if she was to understand the world she had been pulled into, she needed to see it with her own eyes. The following evening, dressed in her simplest black dress, she found herself in a dining room that looked like something torn from another world. Crystal chandeliers dripped light across polished wood. Silver gleamed on the table. Men in tailored suits lingered at the edges of the room, silent as statues. At the center sat Vincenzo Russo, his gaze fixed on her as though she were the only guest who mattered. "Maya," he greeted, rising slightly as she entered. "Thank you for accepting." She nodded stiffly, her heart thudding in her chest. "I wasn't sure refusing was an option." The faintest curve touched his lips. "It was, but you chose to come." As the meal unfolded, Maya kept her guard high. She listened more than she spoke, watching the men who came and went, noting the quiet deference with which they treated Russo. Their conversations skimmed over business ventures, properties and names she didn't recognize, but beneath the surface she sensed layers of influence and power that stretched deeper than she could fathom. Russo, for his part, asked her questions about her life, her work at the diner, her mother's health, her dreams for the future. His tone was calm, respectful even, but his intensity never faltered. It was as though he was gathering every piece of her, weighing her character with invisible scales. Finally, she set down her fork and met his gaze head-on. "Why me, Mr. Russo? There are hundreds of people your son could have met. Why are you letting him get attached to me?" For a moment, silence hung heavy. Then Russo leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "Because you are the first person in his life who acted without calculation. You saw only a child in need, not a name, not a legacy, not a risk. That is rare. My son sees the truth of people faster than most, and he has chosen you. For that alone, I must listen." Maya's stomach nodded. "And if I don't want to be part of whatever this is? If I just want my life back?" Russo's eyes darkened, but not with anger, with something far more complex. Then you will have it. I do not force. But know this, Miss Williams, fate does not let go so easily. You stepped into a fire that night, and fires have a way of spreading. His words chilled her, not as a threat, but as a grim reality. She thought of Danny's small hands, of the way he clung to her with complete trust, and she realized he was right. Even if she tried to walk away, some part of her heart was already bound to that boy, and by extension to the world that surrounded him. That night, as the car drove her home, Maya sat in silence, staring at the city lights rushing past. She understood now. Vincenzo Russo was not just a grateful father. He was a man whose life was steeped in shadows, whose power stretched across the city in ways she could not comprehend. She had not only saved a child, she had stepped into a story far bigger, far darker than her own. And though fear whispered at the edges of her mind, a stronger voice echoed louder. Danny needed her. That truth alone anchored her, even as shadows closed in around them all. An unexpected bond. The morning after the robbery, the hospital's quiet corridors carried the smell of antiseptic and the faint echo of hurried footsteps. Maya lay against the stiff mattress, her arm neatly stitched and bandaged, but sleep had been a stranger to her all night. She wasn't haunted by the pain. It was the memory of gunfire cracking overhead, the sound of a child's cry splitting the chaos, and the weight of a little body trembling beneath her arm. Even now, when she closed her eyes, she felt the echo of Danny's small hands clutching her shirt, his terrified voice whispering her name, as if she had always been his safe place. She should have been relieved that it was over, that the boy had been returned to his father's care, that she had survived. Yet something inside her twisted, restless. Perhaps it was the look in Danny's eyes when he clung to her, refusing to let go even as his father stood beside him. A bond had formed in those minutes of terror, a bond neither blood nor time could have predicted. By late morning, she assumed she would be discharged quietly and sent back to her ordinary life. The thought of slipping into the anonymity of her small apartment seemed like the natural conclusion. But fate had other plans. The door to her room opened and she saw him again. Vincenzo Russo. The man carried himself with the same weight as before, a presence that filled the room before his voice even spoke. His suit was as crisp as if he had stepped out of a magazine, his expression controlled, yet his eyes revealed a storm of thoughts. Behind him, as always, two men lingered near the doorway, silent and watchful. And in front of him, moving quickly with the lightness of a child, came Danny. The boy ran to her bedside before she could even sit up straighter, his arms wrapping around her good arm with a force that startled her. "Maya," he exclaimed, his voice full of a warmth that pushed away the sterile chill of the room. "I knew you'd still be here." Maya blinked, then let out a small laugh to spite herself. "Danny, you didn't think they'd throw me out with stitches, did you?" The boy grinned, relief spilling across his face. He perched himself on the edge of the bed as though it were the most natural thing in the world, his little legs swinging freely. His father stood close by, his watchful gaze fixed on both of them, though Maya could feel his attention was more on her than on his son. "I told Daddy you were my hero," Danny announced, his chest puffing out slightly. "You saved me, so now you're stuck with me. That's how it works." Maya's lips curved, though her eyes softened with something heavier. She looked at Vincenzo, unsure how much of Danny's words amused or concerned him. To her surprise, the man's mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly, in the shadow of a smile. "Danny has not stopped speaking about you since last night," Vincenzo said, his voice deep, resonant yet softer when it lingered on his son's name. "He insists that you are the bravest person he's ever known." Maya shifted uncomfortably, unused to such praise. "I'm not brave. I was just there. Anyone would have done the same." "On the contrary," Vincenzo replied smoothly. A room full of people froze. "You moved. That difference is not small." Their eyes met, and Maya felt the weight of his scrutiny again. It was not romantic, not even admiring in the usual sense. It was the gaze of a man accustomed to measuring people, to assessing their strength, their worth, their place in a world where weakness could cost everything. And yet there was respect there, a kind of acknowledgement that she had passed an invisible test without even knowing it. Danny interrupted before Maya could reply, tugging gently at her hand. "Can I visit you again, please?" "I don't care what Daddy says. You're my hero now. Heroes don't disappear after one night." The plea in his voice pierced her heart. She hesitated, glancing at Vincenzo, unsure if she was stepping into something she didn't understand. His expression gave little away, but after a long pause, he inclined his head ever so slightly. "If Maya agrees," he said, his tone even, "you may see her again." Maya looked back at Danny's hopeful face and sighed softly. "Of course, Danny, I'll be around for a little while. But you need to listen to your dad, okay? No sneaking away or making trouble for the nurses." Danny grinned, satisfied with her answer, and leaned against her side as though she belonged to him already. For a moment the sight startled Maya. This child, so trusting, attaching himself to her as if she were part of his world. She had spent most of her life keeping her distance, guarding her heart from attachments that only led to disappointment. Yet here she was with a boy who had chosen her without hesitation. Vincenzo watched the interaction closely. His son's attachment to this woman was unusual, even extraordinary. Danny had grown up surrounded by guards, tutors, and teachers who came and went at his father's command. Yet he had never clung to anyone outside the family with such desperation. Maya Williams, a woman with no connection to their world, had done in minutes what years of privilege and protection could not. She had earned his son's trust completely. After a long silence, Vincenzo stepped closer. "You have changed something, Miss Williams," he said quietly. "Danny sees you as more than just a rescuer. He sees you as someone he belongs to." "I cannot ignore that." Maya met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because he's a child and he needed someone. That's all?" "Perhaps," Vincenzo replied, his tone unreadable. "But intentions do not always decide outcomes. Sometimes fate chooses for us." His words unsettled her, not because of their meaning, but because of the truth they carried. Maya hadn't sought this bond, hadn't asked to be pulled into the orbit of a man like Vincenzo Russo or his son. Yet here she was, caught in something larger than herself, and the strings of destiny felt tighter with each passing hour. Danny, blissfully unaware of the tension between the adults, leaned against her and began recounting his favorite cartoons and the toys he loved most, his small voice filling the sterile hospital room with innocence. Maya listened, smiling at his enthusiasm, but her thoughts wandered. She had stepped into the fire once, shielding him from bullets. But what if the fire around this boy and his family burned far hotter than she imagined? As she looked down at Danny, his little fingers curled around hers, Maya felt a wave of protectiveness she couldn't shake. She knew deep down that she would never walk away, no matter the risks. And as Vincenzo stood nearby, watching the unspoken promise between them, he knew it too. This woman, whether she wanted it or not, had become a part of their lives. And the bond forming between her and his son was only the beginning of a story that none of them could control. A stranger's child. The chaos of the supermarket had quieted, but inside Maya's chest the storm still raged. Sirens blared outside the shattered glass doors, their echoes mixing with the frantic voices of police officers securing the scene. Medics weaved through the aisles, checking trembling shoppers and tending to minor wounds. For Maya, though, the bleeding cut on her arm wasn't what held her frozen. It was the boy, Danny, whose hand still clutched hers like a lifeline. His small body trembled against her side, his wide eyes fixed on her with a mixture of trust and fear. She had been a stranger minutes ago, yet in his mind, she had become the only person who could keep him safe. When the paramedics insisted she sit down, Maya reluctantly let them guide her to a stretcher. The sting of antiseptic burned against her raw wound, but she gritted her teeth and didn't flinch. She had felt worse before, though never quite like this. Pain was familiar, but carrying the weight of someone else's fear, that was new. The little boy clung to her side even as an officer bent down to ask his name. "Danny Russo," he whispered, almost too softly to hear, his pale face hidden against Maya's shoulder. The officer's expression shifted, his professional mask faltering for just a second before snapping back into place. Maya noticed the glance he exchanged with another officer nearby, quick, sharp, almost cautious. She wondered what it meant, but before she could ask, the medic gently urged her to lie back. "You're lucky, ma'am," the paramedic told her as he wrapped her arm. "That bullet just grazed you. Another inch and—" He didn't finish the sentence, and Maya didn't need him to. She nodded, silent, her gaze fixed on the boy who refused to let her hand go. The ride to the hospital blurred into fragments, flashing red lights against the dark Brooklyn sky. Danny's hand wrapped tightly in hers, the muted crackle of police radios. When they arrived, doctors moved quickly, stitching the shallow wound on her arm. Through it all, Danny remained nearby, his eyes following her with the stubborn intensity only children could muster. He didn't cry anymore, but every time a nurse tried to take him aside, he shook his head and clung tighter. "Ma'am," one of the officers finally said as she rested against the hospital bed, "the boy's family will want to know where he is." "We've already contacted his father." Maya nodded absently, exhaustion washing over her. She hadn't even thought of his parents, hadn't considered that the little boy she'd shielded belonged to someone who must have been frantic with worry. She was just relieved he was alive. That was enough. But then the door to the hospital room opened and everything shifted. He entered like a shadow, tall and imposing, with an aura that seemed to press against the walls themselves. His suit was immaculate, but it was his eyes that caught Maya's attention. Dark, piercing, carrying a weight she couldn't place. Two men followed him, broad-shouldered and watchful, their gazes sweeping the room as though danger might leap from the corners. The boy's face lit up instantly. "Daddy!" Danny cried, scrambling off the chair and running into the man's arms. The transformation was immediate. The cold, commanding presence softened as he scooped his son up, holding him close with a fierce tenderness that seemed almost out of place on a man who radiated such power. "Danny," the man murmured, pressing his lips to his son's hair. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" The boy shook his head quickly, his small arms wrapping tightly around his father's neck. "No, Daddy, she saved me." He pointed to Maya, his voice firm despite his earlier fear. "She protected me. She didn't let them get me." The man turned his gaze to Maya, and she felt it like a weight pressing against her chest. Gratitude was there, yes, but something else too, something sharper, more calculating. He studied her as if trying to decide what kind of woman would throw herself in front of bullets for a child she didn't know. "You have my thanks," he said finally, his voice deep, smooth and carrying an authority that made the officers in the room straighten unconsciously. "You shielded my son when no one else moved. I owe you more than words can cover." Maya, still weary and sore, managed a small shrug. "I didn't think, I just saw a little boy who needed someone. That's all." For a moment, silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the beeping of the hospital monitor. The man's jaw tightened, then eased. He set Danny down gently beside her bed, and the boy immediately reached for her hand again, unwilling to release her from his orbit. "My name is Vincenzo Russo," the man said at last, his gaze unwavering. "And you've done more than save a child tonight. You've saved my entire world." The name hit Maya like a quiet thunderclap. She didn't follow the gossip of Brooklyn's undercurrents, but even she had heard whispers of the Russo name. It was a name spoken in low voices, a name associated with power, wealth, and shadows that stretched further than most dared to imagine. Her stomach tightened, a ripple of unease running through her veins. Danny's father wasn't just an ordinary man. He was someone people feared, and somehow, without knowing, she had stepped directly into his world. The officers in the room shifted awkwardly, suddenly more restrained in their presence. The paramedics busied themselves with charts, careful not to meet Russo's eyes. It was clear that this was a man whose influence bent the air around him. Maya swallowed hard, her voice quiet but steady. "I'm glad your son's safe. That's what matters." Vincenzo studied her for another long moment, then gave a small nod. "Safe because of you." He motioned to one of his men, who stepped forward silently. "Anything she needs. Medical bills, protection, whatever it takes. She is not to be left vulnerable after what she's done." Maya stiffened, her pride sparking. "That won't be necessary. I can take care of myself." Russo's lips curved, though not in amusement, more like recognition of a trait he didn't often encounter. "Bravery and pride. I see why my son clings to you already." His gaze flicked to Danny, who still held Maya's hand as if afraid she might vanish. Maya looked down at the boy's pale blue eyes, so full of trust, and felt her chest ache. She had only known him for a few hours, yet something inside her stirred with a fierce protectiveness she couldn't explain. She should have been relieved to be alive, eager to go home, ready to put this nightmare behind her. Instead, she sat in that sterile hospital room, realizing her life had just crossed paths with something far larger, far heavier, than she had ever imagined. The little boy she had shielded was not just any child. He was the son of Vincenzo Russo, the most powerful and most dangerous man she had ever met, and though she didn't know it yet, Her choice in that supermarket would ripple through her life in ways she could never have foreseen. The shield of courage. The supermarket aisles smelled of warm bread and detergent, the kind of mixed scent you only noticed after a long day of work. Maya Williams pressed her shopping basket against her hip. Inside were just the basics: bread, milk, eggs. The kind of things a woman bought at the end of the week when her paycheck had already been stretched thin. She wasn't one for luxuries. Every cent went into paying the rent for her small Brooklyn apartment and making sure her mother's medicine stayed stocked. Her feet ached from a double shift at the diner where she worked. Her dark curls were tied back with a fading bandana. She should have been home by now, heating up leftovers, resting her legs, but something had pushed her into this little supermarket on the corner of Fulton Street. Maya hummed softly under her breath as she walked past the candy aisle. She didn't even notice the little boy at first. Not until she heard the sound, a sob. A small, trembling cry that didn't belong in a supermarket. She turned her head. There he was, 6 years old, maybe 7. Blonde hair messy like he'd been running, a blue jacket too big for his thin shoulders. His hands clutched at nothing, his face streaked with tears. He wasn't calling for his mom. He wasn't calling for help. He was crying one word: Daddy. The sound broke Maya's heart in half. She took a step toward him, her lips parting when it happened. The front doors banged open. 3 men stormed inside, masks pulled low over their faces. The metallic shine of guns glinted under the fluorescent lights. Everybody down, one of them shouted, his voice sharp enough to slice through the hum of the refrigerators. Nobody move or somebody dies. Gasps rippled through the store. Shoppers screamed. A clerk dropped a carton of eggs that burst across the tiles like shattered porcelain. One of the robbers fired into the air. The sound cracked like thunder echoing off the walls. Shelves rattled. Children wailed. The floor seemed to shiver under Maya's shoes. Her basket slipped from her hand, crashing to the ground. The bread rolled one way, the milk another. Her breath caught in her chest. She looked at the boy again. He hadn't moved. His pale blue eyes were wide, his chest heaving. He was frozen in place like a rabbit before a wolf. The gunmen hadn't noticed him yet, but they would. Mama, please, Maya whispered to herself, a prayer she hadn't said in years. Her body moved before her mind could argue. Her legs sprinted. She crossed the aisle in 3 steps, her shoes squeaking on the tile. Get down, kid, she shouted, voice cracking with fear. The boy blinked, but he didn't move. His legs were jelly. His hand shook, so Maya did the only thing she could. She threw herself on top of him, her arms wrapping around his tiny frame. She pushed him to the ground, pressing his head against her chest. A shot rang out again, this one closer. She felt heat slice past her ear, sharp and biting. Pain seared across her left arm as the bullet grazed her skin. Hot blood trickled down, soaking into her sleeve. She gasped, but her body didn't loosen. She curled tighter around the boy, becoming a shield. The boy whimpered beneath her, his tiny hands clutching at her shirt. It's okay, Maya whispered, even though her heart hammered so loudly she thought it might burst. You're safe. I've got you. Stay low. The robbers barked at the cashier to empty the registers. One of them paced like a wolf in a cage, waving his pistol at the cowering shoppers. Maya pressed her cheek against the boy's hair, whispering steady words to keep him calm. What's your name, baby? She asked softly, her breath warm against his ear. Danny, he stammered. Okay, Danny. I need you to be brave for me. Can you do that? His little body trembled. His eyes brimmed with tears, but he nodded against her chest. That's it, Maya soothed. We're going to get through this. I promise. She didn't know if that was true. She didn't know if either of them would walk out alive. But children needed hope more than truth sometimes. Another shout echoed from the front of the store. Hurry it up! The sound of coins clattering, the rip of bills being stuffed into bags. The robbers were growing impatient. Maya's arm throbbed with fire. She clenched her teeth against the pain. She thought of her mother back home waiting for her. She thought of her younger self, small, scared, with no one to shield her. Not today. Not for this boy. Minutes dragged like hours. The robbers cursed, one firing another shot into the ceiling. Dust rained down. A baby wailed somewhere in the back. Finally, a voice barked. Let's go! Their footsteps pounded toward the exit. The automatic doors swished open, then slammed shut. Silence settled like a heavy blanket, broken only by sobs. Maya didn't move at first. Her body shook, adrenaline refusing to let her go. She kept Danny tight against her chest until she heard the sirens wailing outside. Only then did she loosen her arms. "Danny, you okay?" she whispered, her voice raw. The boy blinked up at her with wide, watery eyes. Then, to her shock, he whispered, "My dad's going to be so mad." Maya almost laughed, the sound broken and disbelieving. "Sweetheart, your dad's just going to be glad you're safe." But something in the boy's words stuck to her skin like ice. Sirens grew louder. Police stormed inside, shouting commands. Medics rushed forward. Shoppers lifted their heads from behind shelves and counters. One medic knelt beside Maya, pressing gauze against her bleeding arm. "You're a hero, ma'am." "You saved that kid's life, hero." The word didn't sit right. She hadn't thought. She'd just done what she had to. Danny clung to her hand as the medic worked. He refused to let go, his small fingers gripping hers like she was his anchor in the storm. And as Maya looked into his frightened eyes, she had no idea that this boy, this child she had shielded with her own body, was no ordinary boy. No, he was the son of one of the most powerful men in the city. A man whose world Maya was about to stumble into, a world that would test her courage more than any bullet ever could.